Someone ordered a watch from a micro brand 6 months ago. They paid in full. They got the confirmation email, the estimated shipping date, and the occasional update saying production was on track. Then the update stopped. Then a different email arrived, not a shipping notification, but an apology. The movement they ordered had changed. Not the dial, not the case, not the strap. The engine inside the watch, the thing that makes it tick, had changed without the buyer being consulted, because the movement that was supposed to go into their watch no longer existed in sufficient supply to fulfill the order. That scenario is playing out across the micro-brand watch industry right now, in volume. The buyers experiencing it are the least visible part of a supply chain crisis that is quietly threatening the most interesting corner of the watch market, the one that has been producing genuinely compelling watches at prices that make the Swiss luxury houses look embarrassed. This video covers what is actually happening, why it started, who is responsible for it, and what it means for anyone who buys or is considering buying a watch from the independent and micro brand segment. Subscribe to the channel, it means a lot and helps keep this going. To understand the crisis, the starting point is understanding what the micro brand watch industry actually runs on, because most buyers do not know. That lack of knowledge is part of why the current situation is catching so many people off guard. The overwhelming majority of automatic micro-brand watches in the accessible price range, the watches selling between $300 and $1,500 that have driven the most interesting growth in collecting over the past decade, run on one of two movement families. They are the Seiko NH series and the Miyota 9000 series. Those two families are the engines of an entire industry segment, not a significant fraction of it. The overwhelming majority of it. The Seiko NH movement, specifically the NH34, NH35, and NH36, became the default choice for micro-brands for reasons that are entirely rational. The movements are reliable, they run at a beat rate that produces acceptable accuracy for the price, they are widely available from suppliers, and the service infrastructure for them is established enough that watchmakers globally know how to work on them. A micro-brand choosing to run an NH35 and a $1,500 watch is not making a compromise. They are making a competent engineering decision about which movement has the best combination of quality, availability, and cost for their buyer. Until recently, that availability was not something anyone thought twice about. The movements were there when you needed them, at prices that allowed micro-brands to build competitive products without inflating their retail pricing to cover movement costs. That is over. Here is what happened and why the timing matters. Seiko, as a company, is having one of the best runs in its modern history. The brand's own watches, not the movements, but the complete Seiko watches with NH movements inside them, are selling at a pace that has not been seen in years. The Seiko 5 lineup, the Prospex family, the SKX successors, all of them run on the same NH movement families that the micro-brand industry depends on. When Seiko has to decide who gets the movements their factories are producing, the answer is not complicated. Seiko's own watches come first. The movements sold to third-party brands come second. The result is that the supply of NH movements available to the broader market has tightened in ways that have no obvious resolution in the near term. Seiko is not going to slow down production of its own watches to free up movements for other brands. The company has no obligation to do that, and there is every business reason not to. Seiko's success is genuinely good for the company. The micro-brand industry built itself on a dependency that was convenient when the supplier had surplus capacity and is now discovering what that dependency looks like when the surplus disappears. This has happened before. The parallel is almost exact, and understanding it explains both how bad the current situation is likely to get and roughly how it resolves. In the early 2000s, the Swiss watch industry ran on ETA movements. ETA, owned by the Swatch Group, was the supplier to virtually everyone, independent brands, luxury houses that did not manufacture their own movements, and the entire mid-tier of Swiss watchmaking. Then the Swatch Group announced that ETA movements would no longer be sold to brands outside the Swatch Group umbrella. The Swiss watch industry, which had built itself on the assumption that ETA supply was indefinite, had to scramble for alternatives almost overnight. Sellita emerged from that crisis as the primary alternative. Other brands invested in their own movement manufacturing. The industry adapted, but the transition was painful. It produced exactly the kind of chaos the micro-brand industry is entering now: delays, unexpected movement changes, price increases, and brands that simply could not survive the disruption. The names that survived are the ones the industry remembers. The ones that folded are largely forgotten because there was no community infrastructure at the time to document what was happening. The micro-brand segment today has that infrastructure. It will keep more brands visible through the crisis. It will not save the ones that cannot absorb the cost. The current situation differs in one important way. The ETA restriction was a deliberate policy decision that the Swatch Group announced and then partially reversed under legal and market pressure. The Seiko movement shortage is not a policy decision. It is a consequence of Seiko's own commercial success. There is no decision to reverse, no court to appeal to, no announcement that will be walked back. The shortage is a market condition, and market conditions resolve on their own timeline. What that means for the micro-brand industry is that the resolution is not coming on any predictable schedule. Subscribe to support the channel. Genuinely appreciated. The industry's response has been to pivot toward Miyota. The 9000 series, particularly the no-date variants, has become the default alternative for brands that built their product line around Seiko NH movements and need to continue production. There are two problems with this pivot. The first is that the Miyota 9000, while a capable movement, is not a drop-in replacement for the NH series. The dimensions differ. Watches designed around an NH movement need to be reconfigured to accept a Miyota movement, which means engineering time, tooling adjustments, and in some cases changes to the case design that propagate into the rest of the product. That is not a 6-week transition. For a small brand with limited engineering resources, it is a months-long disruption that has real costs and real delays. The second problem is that the pivot is already happening at scale, and the Miyota 9000 supply is tightening in direct response. Every brand that moves from Seiko to Miyota adds demand to a supply chain that was not sized for the incoming volume. The 9000 variants that are most useful, the no-date configuration and the higher-grade finishing options, are already showing the early signs of the same shortage that pushed brands away from Seiko in the first place. The industry is not solving the problem by moving to Miyota. It is distributing the problem across a second supplier. The alternatives beyond Miyota exist, but none are straightforward. Chinese manufactured movements, primarily from Seagull, have improved significantly in quality over the past decade. The challenge is perception. A meaningful portion of the micro-brand buyer base has strong preferences about movement origin, and switching from Japanese to Chinese faces a communications challenge beyond technical specifications. Swiss alternatives such as Soprod, Sellita, and certain ETA variants come at price points that fundamentally change the economics of the watches they go into. A movement costing 3 times the old NH, 3.5 price does not slot quietly into a product designed around a different cost structure. It raises retail price, compresses margins to unsustainable levels, or requires a complete redesign of the product tier the brand operates in. None of those transitions are quick or cheap, and they are not happening in isolation. They are all happening simultaneously across an industry where most participants are small operations without deep reserves. For the buyer, the immediate consequence is straightforward and not good. Prices are going up, not because micro-brands are opportunistically inflating their margins, but because the cost of movements has genuinely increased. An NH35 that cost around $30 a year ago is now trading above $100 among suppliers who have remaining stock. Brands that built their pricing structure around the old movement cost are either absorbing a significant margin hit or passing the cost to buyers. The watches that were genuinely compelling value propositions at $600 become less compelling at $800. Some of them become impossible to justify at all when compared to the alternatives at that price. Beyond the pricing impact, the buyer faces something more disorienting. the uncertainty about what they are actually ordering when they place a deposit on a watch that is not yet in production. The movement specification in a campaign or pre-order may not reflect the movement that ends up in the finished watch. Brands making this switch are not doing it dishonestly in most cases. They are making the best decision available to them under a supply constraint they did not create. But the buyer who pre-ordered based on a specific movement and receives something different has a legitimate grievance, and the number of buyers in that position is growing. The brands most at risk from this crisis are the ones that built their identity around specific movement characteristics and cannot substitute without undermining their own product story. A brand that has marketed its watch specifically on the basis of the NH35 specifications, its accuracy, its winding rotor, and its particular price, has a harder time explaining why the watch now contains a different movement than a brand that positioned itself around other attributes like case design or dial craft. The brands that will navigate this best are the ones that have already started communicating transparently with their buyers about the situation, that have been honest about the constraints they are working under, and that have treated the change as information the buyer deserves rather than a detail to be buried in fine print. Those brands will retain the trust that makes the micro-brand relationship work. The ones that slip in movement changes quietly, or that delay fulfillment without explanation, will discover that the micro-brand buyer is more attentive and more connected to community information than the buyers of established brands. The forums notice. The Discord servers notice. The information travels fast. If you are considering a micro-brand purchase right now, there are specific questions worth asking before you place any deposit. Ask about the movement that is specified for the production run. Has that movement been confirmed in stock, or is it subject to availability at the time of production? What is the brand's policy if the specified movement becomes unavailable? Will they notify buyers before substituting? Will they offer a refund option? Or will they treat the switch as a production detail within their discretion? The brands that answer those questions clearly, without deflection, are the ones worth backing. The ones that respond with vague reassurances or do not have a clear policy are the ones most likely to produce the email 6 months from now explaining that things changed. Getting those answers before the deposit is not a sign of distrust toward the brand. It is basic consumer due diligence in an environment where the supply chain is genuinely unstable. For buyers who already have pre-orders outstanding, checking in directly with the brand about current production status is worth the 5-minute email. Most legitimate micro-brand founders are more accessible than mainstream brands, and a direct question about movement availability right now will usually get a more honest answer than waiting for an update to arrive in the inbox. What the broader watch market should take from this is a specific lesson about the economics of the affordable automatic watch. The accessible price tier has been subsidized in a structural sense by the existence of high-quality movements available at prices that allowed brands to build genuinely competitive products without charging what the movement quality would suggest. The NH series in particular represented a situation where the manufacturing scale of a global company was creating movement quality that a smaller manufacturer could not replicate at anything near the same cost. Micro brands were accessing Seiko's scale advantages without Seiko extracting the full value of those advantages. That access is ending. Not because of a policy change, but because Seiko found a better use for its own production capacity, selling complete watches rather than components. The subsidy is being withdrawn. The price of accessible automatic watches is going to rise to reflect the actual cost of producing them without access to Seiko's scale, and the market is going to have to decide what it is willing to pay. Some buyers will follow the price increase because the micro-brand relationship, the direct connection to founders, the transparency of production, and the sense of buying something built with specific intention rather than optimized for retail shelf space is worth the higher cost. Some buyers will not, and will drift toward the mainstream brands that can absorb the movement cost through their own scale. The micro-brand segment will survive this. The ETA crisis of the early 2000s led to Salita, to a generation of in-house movements, and ultimately to a Swiss industry less dependent on a single supplier than it had been before. The current crisis will produce something similar. New movement alternatives will develop, existing alternatives will expand production, and the industry will find a new equilibrium. The transition period is the painful part. Buyers caught in the middle, waiting on orders that are delayed or surprised by movement changes in products they already purchased, are experiencing the cost of a supply chain vulnerability the industry built and that marketing never disclosed. The dealer paying what they call stupid money for Seiko movements just to keep orders fulfilled is not a story about one brand's supply chain problem. It is a story about how an entire industry segment priced itself and what happens when the conditions that made that pricing possible change without warning. Knowing this is knowing something. The watch content ecosystem largely has not told buyers, because content about movement shortages does not drive pre-order deposits or affiliate sales. Understanding why watches in this segment are about to get more expensive, or why a watch on order might arrive with a different engine than the one in the campaign, is the kind of information that only helps the buyer, which is exactly why it belongs here. If this kind of content is valuable to you, subscribing to the channel is the best way to show that. It is genuinely appreciated every single time.